Oh, de dum de dum de dum dum dum. Oh, that sound of dumb. That would be me. No mic today, so we don't have the music that we usually use to ease you into a sort of listening frame and participating frame of mind here on Law and Legitimacy. I'm told by Mike, wait 20, 25 seconds before you jump into the content. And now we're here. So Mike is on the road today. He had to go to court. He has a 3 hour commute ahead of him and said, Norm, you AMF, yo, yo, adios, MF. You're on your own this morning. I'll be flying solo. Basically, we're going to deal with a couple of topics, and I'll jump into the cheery one first, and then we'll go to the more quotidian. Quotidian being one of my favorite words. In the first book I published called what was it? Taking Back the Courts. I got a foreword from no less a person than F. Lee Bailey, and F. Lee Bailey complained that some of the words he had to go to the dictionary for, and I thought that's pretty cool, sending F. Lee Bailey to the dictionary. And there ain't no shame in loving the English language. So quotidian means ordinary, the quotidian conflicts of our time. So let's jump in. There's an interesting controversy brewing on social media today. Tom Shattuck comments on the Boston Globe's, and the topic is assisted suicide. So try to stay alive. I'll try to get you through this half an hour. Call the Law and Legitimacy Suicide Hotline. If you've given up hope and think that there's no reason to keep living, I've got one answer for you. Every morning at 8 o'clock, you can listen to us. Then you can kill yourself, or you can return the following day. In any case, the Boston Globe sent one of their reporters, Kevin Cullen, to Vermont to report on a Connecticut woman's traveling there to engage in assisted suicide. And this has some folks on the internet exercised and wound up. Tom Shattuck writes, the Boston Globe sends their grim reaper up to Vermont, and he delivers. Kevin Cully expedites the end of a woman's life, a new twist on the concept of a deadline. We talk about this unbelievable story on at Burn Barrel, BURNBARREL pod. It's not something that I've listened to. Maybe I'll get to it. Most likely I won't. But it did make me try to find the Boston Globe story. I wasn't able to this morning. If Mike were here, it would be on the screen right now, and he would be reading selected text from it. But instead, I'm going to just talk about the concept of assisted suicide and where it exists within the jurisprudence of con law. And I'm referring, those of you law nerds know, to the case of Washington versus Glucksberg, decided in 1997. The question presented to the Supreme Court in Glucksberg is, if we say that the due process clause contains or embeds a concept of privacy or personal autonomy, ought we not then have the right as a matter of law to take our own lives? And I'm not talking about as a matter of fact. Nothing prevents any one of you right now, from going over to the gun closet and, sticking a barrel in your mouth, pulling the trigger and saying, AMF, yo-yo, I'm off to the afterlife or some other means. As a matter of fact, we as sentient creatures have that ability. And it is marvelous to me. I marvel at it. That's why I broke down marvelous. I marvel that in the animal kingdom, we alone appear to be a species dedicated to self-destruction. Or if not dedicated to it, at least capable of it, and doing so in large numbers. I've never heard of a dog saying, I've had enough, jumping in front of a car. I'm reading a book about the relationship between an octopus and a woman right now. It's a new book, Dangerously Bright Creatures, or Marvelously. I can't remember the title. Well, I'll report more on it when I finish it. Fantastic book. The octopus, is suggesting suicidal thoughts as he lives in captivity in an aquarium. But we alone among the animal kingdom seem to have the ability and the will and the desire to kill ourselves. And so, does the government have a right to stop us? Now, suicide is presumed unlawful under the American rule. And thus helping a person end their own life is a violation of the law. So in Washington v. Glucksberg, a person said, "Wait a minute, I'm terminally ill. I've been given a prognosis. There is no hope for me, but endless suffering and pain. I'd like to cut to the chase and jump off. And as a matter of personal autonomy, I'm going to do so. And I would like to do so with as little pain or aggravation as possible. Who is the person I trust most with my pharmaceutical care? My physician. I want the doctor to help me." And in Washington, it was not permitted. And so the case went up to the United States Supreme Court, and the lawyers tried to argue that we have this notion called substantive due process. In the 14th Amendment, all persons are guaranteed due process of law. There is a procedural aspect to it and a substantive aspect. The procedural means that before the state or some governmental entity can adversely affect you by affecting either your liberty or your property interests, it has to provide you with minimal notice and an opportunity to be heard. And the context of what that means varies on the circumstances and could be a topic. And frankly, is the topic of an entire course in law school called administrative law. That's not our purpose here. There's a second prong in the due process clause called substantive due process. Are there certain rights that are so fundamental that our concept of ordered liberty is inconceivable without them? And there has been an emerging body of law within most of our lifetimes that has expanded the scope of substantive due process. Gay marriage is anchored in that right. The right to engage in homosexual sodomy is encompassed within that right. And Anthony Kennedy has written, and the right to abortion was subsumed within that right as well when it was recognized. And in some of the language, Anthony Kennedy spoke most eloquently. He said, "Substantive due process is that liberty without which we can't have a concept of society." And the notion that we should be free fundamentally to determine our own terms and conditions of existence is something that we regard as fundamental to the American experience. Therefore, you can marry a man if you want to. You can't marry multiple men or multiple women, at least not yet. You can't marry your dog, at least not yet. But when pressed to its limit, that language about being able to come up with your own fundamental conception of existence and being able to live it would support both of those rights. It's just we don't have a social consensus that those are good things, at least not yet, or at least the means to stop them, at least not yet. So within the context of substantive due process, what is wrong with saying that if I have a right to determine what is good about my life, what makes it worth living, and I have the means and the ability to consider taking my own life, what gives the state the right to prevent it as a matter of law? Certainly there is a presumption in favor of life in American law, a presumption that life is a good thing, a presumption that it is to be preserved, if necessary, at all costs. But if a person chooses to say, well, for whatever reasons, the cost of living is more than I'm willing to bear, what right does the state have to interfere with it? In Washington versus Glucksberg, the Supreme Court held that substantive due process does not extend to the right to have assistance in your own suicide. Candidly, and I don't think this case has arisen in the Supreme Court yet, suppose you were going to jump off a bridge because you've decided, you can't get a physician's assistant, so the Hudson River will do. And the state takes you into custody because you're a danger to yourself or others at that point. Wouldn't you have a right to say under the theory advanced in Glucksberg, that the state interfered with your fundamental right to destroy yourself? And unwilling to face the policy consequences of that, the Supreme Court did not extend the fundamental right to assisted suicide or even to suicide at all to the list of those protected under the substantive due process clause. Thus, the Globe story apparently is a reporter going with a woman who decided to end her own life and found a physician or medical professional willing to help her in Vermont. And he reported on her decision, the obstacles that she faced in executing that decision, the manner in which the decision was made, and then apparently took photographs of her as she expired. I'm not sure I find the reporting shocking. This isn't the functional equivalent of embedding a reporter in Hamas and saying, let's go invade Israel and kill some people. I just don't see that. but some people do online. And of course, there is the theological argument that life being a gift from God, it is a mortal sin to reject it. It is the ultimate way of the pot saying to the potter, why makest me thus? I refuse to live in the shape that you have formed me in, and therefore I'm giving my life back to you. That would be a theological argument, an argument from natural law. I'm not sure it's and I'm not sure those arguments have a place, at least an easy place, one that I can locate within the American constitutional system. So I'd ask somebody, among you folks with time on your hands, track down this website, Burn Barrel, Burn Barrel, BURNBARREL pod, Burn Barrel pod. They're exercised about the Boston Globe's coverage of this event. I'm merely intrigued, and I point out to you this debate about assisted suicide and substantive due process because I want to educate you about the law, and substantive due process is a great thing, apparently, when it favors things you want, but sometimes it can lead to troubling consequences. What's up in immigration world? Last night, the House, I think I wrote it down because I can't remember anything. You get to be a certain age and notes are your savior. The House Homeland Security Committee last night voted on partisan lines for the impeachment of the Secretary of Immigration, or I guess Homeland Security. I can't even remember the name of the cabinet position, frankly. But Mr. Mayorkas, who has oversight of immigration policy in the United States, and it was voted out on policy on party lines. Democrats voted against the Mayorkas impeachment. Republicans voted in favor of it. And so now it will go to the full House for a vote to determine whether he should have a trial in the Senate for engaging in high crimes and misdemeanors, such that he should not occupy his position. Alan Dershowitz wrote an interesting op-ed piece overnight in the New York Sun. It's published this morning online in the New York Sun, where he basically, and remember, Dershowitz was a defender of Donald Trump in the House impeachment inquiries 4 years ago. Dershowitz argues, and I think correctly, that while we may disagree with Mayorkas's policy positions or his lack of activity or his dereliction of duty with respect to the border, he's not engaged in a high crime and misdemeanor, and therefore he ought not to be impeached. I actually think Dershowitz is right on that. I think that Mayorkas is a cabinet officer who is enacting the policies of the Biden administration, and those policies with respect to the border have been, at a minimum, incoherent to this point, and tending toward favoring an open border. Those who believe that, as I do, that the immigration situation is at a critical point, think it's necessary to have a change in policy course. And the normal way we do that in the United States is by way of an election. If we start to impeach public officials because we disagree with their policy choices, we're going to bring government down to an end. We're going to bring the capacity to government or to govern to an end. And maybe that's what we want to do. And I can hear people will say, and by the way, folks, I don't have access to Rumble comments. So if you're screaming at me on Rumble, hey, Norm, you effing idiot, what about this? What about that? What about the other thing? I'm not ignoring you. I just can't see you. So, I do have YouTube enabled comments on my computer, but not Rumble. And so I apologize to you all for my technological inability. So I think that that impeaching Mayorkas, having a Senate trial on this is sort of ridiculous, and it's going to encourage the sort of hyper-partisanship that has created, in effect, gridlock over time. I see Mike disagrees, and I wonder if he's disagreeing with me. I don't know if he's disagreeing with one of the comments. And if he were here, he might say, well, but there is a fundamental aspect in which a bad policy decision can become a high crime and misdemeanor. If the Constitution charges you with a certain responsibility and you fail to meet that responsibility through inaction, you don't have to necessarily commit a crime or a misdemeanor. You simply have to not show up at the job. You have to sit there and stare at people pouring over the border and say, oh, well, la-di-da-da-da, I guess I can't do nothing about that. That's impeachable. That's an argument. I think it's a dangerous argument to make, especially in the immigration context, where there is a huge debate about what is and isn't appropriate. And so I want to shift quickly to talk a little bit more about the standoff in Texas between Greg Abbott and the United States government. We talked about this last week and called it a potential flashpoint in the United States, a flashpoint almost as significant as the shots that were fired at Fort Sumter, teeing off the Civil War, and for the following reasons. The United States government has a border patrol agency, has under the Constitution the authority to regulate immigration and naturalization. There are a series of statutes and laws that govern what can happen at the border, including a convoluted body of law, creating an exception to the warrant requirement, the need for a warrant to search a person's persons and effects, called the border, exception. So, the Border Patrol people don't need a warrant to search your stuff when you're coming in at the border. They can stop and detain a person within 25 miles of the border. So there's a complicated body of federal law that governs our borders. And the traditional view to date in the United States, at least within our lifetimes, has been that this is a federal power. Abbott is taking a position that would be consistent with the position to impeach Mayorkas, and that is, while the federal government has this power, it's refusing to use it. And by refusing to use it, not only is Mayorkas submitting himself to the rigor and perils of impeachment, the federal government has walked away from its commitment to protect the people of Texas. And one of the reasons that we created a federal republic was that we wanted a federal government powerful enough to protect people and powerful enough to accomplish common objectives. But if it refuses to act, the people that created the federal government, including the states, haven't given up the power to protect themselves. So Abbott points to the invasion clause. I think it's in Article 1st, Section 3, Clause 10, and says, look, we're being invaded. We are being invaded by massive waves of immigrants. According to one statistic that I read, an estimated 250,000 undocumented illegal people flowed into Texas during the month of December alone. That's a huge number. And from Abbott's perspective, it proposes an unsustainable burden on Texas. To prove that point, he's bused immigrants at the expense of Texans to destination locations in so-called sanctuary cities, New York, let's say, where Mary Adams has suddenly cried, "No mas, we can't take it anymore." We've had to start canceling social services that we offered New Yorkers and American citizens in the city in order to divert the resources necessary to provide for people that are being shipped here from Texas. Stop. New York, life as we know it in New York is going to stop. Abbott's point is that life as we know it in the United States is going to stop unless somebody does something. And since the federal government won't, he will. And so at Eagle Pass, he has instructed National Guard people under his authority to erect razor wire, concertina wire, to prevent people from entering unlawfully into the United States government. The federal government has said that's our responsibility. Stop that. They went to the United States Supreme Court on an emergency stay, got an order to Abbott to stand down, and Abbott said, "I ain't doing it. I have the responsibility to act, and when the federal government won't, I will." And so we've got this constitutional standoff here, and I fully expected there to be some sort of struggle, maybe even a violent struggle between armed men bearing allegiance to different sovereigns. The United States government expressing its control of this issue, the state of government expressing its control over the health, education, and welfare of Texans. The federal Texas basically saying to the federal government, "You've broken the compact. The reason we gave you power was for purposes of domestic tranquility. Read the preamble. We the people, we create this thing for, among other things, domestic tranquility, and therefore we're going to act." We didn't discuss the concept of preemption when we talked about this last week, and I wanted to add that to the mix because it's an important concept. So, when you look at the United States Constitution, it's not all that long. And it lays out a structure of government, the federal structure of government with a government of limited federal powers, states with residual powers that are seemingly unlimited, a Bill of Rights that over time has placed limits on what both the state and federal government can do. And thus we are governed. That is, we have strangers set rules, terms, and conditions on what we can do in our lives with one another under a rule of law, constitutional law being the highest law of the land. The Supreme Court has had to create many doctrines to resolve tensions that this presents, and the preemption doctrine is one of them. So preemption, it's not a good Scrabble word. It's Preemption. And what the preemption doctrine holds is that when Congress acts in its legislative function to occupy a field, that is to govern an area, it preempts the ability of states to act. And so under the preemption doctrine, the courts would be tempted to look at a series of immigration laws, and we've had them for over a century in the United States. They adjust who can come in under what conditions, who can be removed under what conditions, and it's an endless hot potato, even in the current Congress today. The preemption doctrine would say that when Congress shows an effort to occupy a field with a comprehensive legislative scheme, the states are preempted from acting. The states are prohibited from acting. Thus, while Congress may preempt or may occupy a field, it may not answer every question that arises. The states in that instance aren't free to come up with their own rules and usurp, as it were, the authority that Congress has existed, because the Constitution, according to the Supremacy Clause, and Constitution and federal law, according to the Supremacy Clause, is the supreme law of the land. And so I think that Abbott is going to run into some significant preemption issues in this standoff. And I think his response will still be the same, that under the invasion clause, when the federal government, even when even under a traditional preemption analysis, has occupied a field, has shown a desire to take control of an area of life, if it does so and fails, or if it creates rules and fails to address real problems that the states discern, the states nonetheless have the power to act. And therefore, I think the constitutional crisis will continue to exist. But I wanted the rest of you, or all of you, to become aware of the preemption doctrine, because I think it's a significant barrier in the way of Greg Abbott. And I think his efforts to use the invasion clause are parallel to the interest in using the insurrection clause to keep Trump from office. At some level, if we're going to have a government, that government is going to be empowered to make decisions. And we, the people, are either going to have to trust the government to get it right, or we're going to withdraw our trust. And in withdrawing that trust, we will stretch the Constitution in different directions, and we may stretch it to the breaking point. And that, I think, is my point about the Eagle Pass standoff, and why I think it's so significant. You know, a good life, Socrates once said, a well-examined life is worth living, or an unexamined life isn't worth living. And so I try to challenge myself on a daily basis to read things that are going to challenge me, that might be counterintuitive to me, that I might disagree with. And so I just finished last night reading Erica Lee's book, America for Americans, a history of xenophobia in the United States. And I just want to challenge all of you to read it. You know, her point is that xenophobia, fear of strangers, is as American pie, but wrong. Xenophobia represents an impulse to fear others, to demonize others, to make others into a scapegoat. And it's as old as the nation's founding. When we arrived, the other that we feared were the Native American inhabitants, as the colonial as colonialists established themselves in the United States, they feared Germans as a source of contamination. Thereafter, the focus switched to the Irish in the 1840s and whatnot during the potato famine in Ireland. And we've always had a fear of African Americans as others in the United States. The focus shifted in the late 19th century to Asians. We had the Chinese exclusion bill, even though we permitted many Chinese to enter in order to help build the railroads and to accomplish cheap labor needs out west. They were regarded as a dangerous alien other. Then our focus has been intermittently and continuously focused on Mexicans as a dangerous and other. Southern Europeans were a dangerous other. In part, animus toward Italians helped inspire the prosecution of Sacco and Vanzetti. And Southern Europeans and Jews were regarded as bearers of dangerous communist and socialist ideologies. In the early 20th century, we were at war with them. Pearl Harbor and Japanese. Obviously, we had the Japanese, the Korematsu decision, the Hirabayashi decision, where Japanese Americans were rounded up on the West Coast and placed in internment camps as a security measure in the wake of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. German Americans were also placed in camps. Italian Americans were also placed in camps. In 9/11, after the bombing of the World Trade Center, the United States went down an Islamophobic rabbit hole, Lee argues. And candidly, I'm one of those Americans. I am an Islamophobe. I've said that before on this broadcast, and I'll say it again. Tim, at 9/11, our focus once again, she argues, turned to China. And we started to talk about the Chinese virus and so forth. And so I think that, her book makes a point. And her book makes a point that in the United States, there's always been a tension between those who are here, who are now or who are currently here, and those who want to come. And, and she's suspicious of that. I mean, her ideological commitment in the book is to open borders, is to claim that the United States is a place that should be available to all on demand. She writes at the very end of her book, on our interconnected and warming planet, you got to love this, right? On our interconnected and warming planet, our future well-being will be inextricably connected to the well-being of those whom we might consider strangers. As all of humanity faces limited resources and opportunities, we cannot afford to practice the closed-mindedness and isolation that xenophobia promotes. In both the past and present, xenophobes have argued that immigrants are threats. But it is xenophobia, not immigration, that is our gravest threat today. It's time to reset the terms of the debate. I just think that's naive on Lee's part. I mean, the fact of the matter, I don't care what color you are. You could be turquoise with green eyes and blue hair. If 250,000 of you cross my border in a single month, what am I supposed to do with all of you? Give you a coloring book and say, woo, welcome to Rainbow Land? Maybe that's the point of the LGBTQ etc. flags in the rainbow. I mean, the fact of the matter is social science suggests that there are such things as groups, and group cohesion depends on a common sense of group identity, and that the other can in fact be a threat and undermine the identity. Having said that, it's a great read. I really recommend that all of you read it, because when she looks back at Operation Wetback, for example. This was during the 1950s, when the U.S. Border Patrol deported millions or hundreds of thousands of Americans, as many as 1 million in 1954, she noted. And she recites a Democrat from Nevada, Patrick McCarran, his rhetoric justifying the deportation of Mexicans in the 1950s. And when you listen to what he said here, it doesn't sound too different than what I'm hearing today. And this is the chilling part of her book, where you begin to think, well, maybe on history's wheel, we all recite the same words and the same fears. It's just the targets of those change. Listen to McCarran. Today, as never before, untold millions are storming our gates for admission, and those gates are cracking under the stream. If America, this last hope of Western civilization and an oasis, were to open its gates, McCarran continues, it would be overrun, perverted, contaminated, or destroyed. And that theme resonates throughout every debate in every new wave of immigration. Lee talks at a different part in the book, however, that xenophobia is a constant. Across the centuries, xenophobia has been an indelible part of America. The target of our xenophobia may have changed from decade to decade, but our fear and hatred of foreigners is not. From the colonial era to the present, xenophobia has been an American tradition. And I guess that, is a good place to end. Is xenophobia a bad thing? Maybe it's consistent with survival. Maybe fear of strangers is why we have locks on our doors. Maybe fear of strangers is why we pledge allegiance to a flag. Maybe fear of strangers is why we cultivate a sense of belonging to a group with common values. Maybe the real danger in the United States is the ideology that Lee is pointing, and that is that in the name of globalism, why can't we all be one and become so denatured that there's no way of telling one person from another, and everybody's entitled to everything, including a spot in your home if they're cold? It seems to me that xenophobia is part and parcel of history because history is tragic. I return once again to St. Augustine and the notion of fall and the original sin, and the notion that there is a city of man and a city of God. We don't live in the city of God. We don't live in a situation where everyone can live together well, peaceably, and happily forever and anon. There's a human stain in the world, and that stain pits us one against another. And certain core ideas in Western civilization, including the state of nature, the notion of war of all against all, and the need for a limited government in which people express allegiance to that government because of a sense of belonging to a group with common values, maybe this is necessary. And maybe something qualitatively have changed this time around in the immigration debate. Maybe it was one thing to have tensions about Germans. Maybe it was one thing to have tensions about Italian Americans. Maybe it was one thing to have tensions about other Southern Europeans. But in the end, they were all assimilated into the United States because they became Italian Americans. We didn't become Muslim Americans. These were people who had fundamental commitments to core beliefs and ideas that were present on the continent. They didn't seek to change and transform the continent into something else. And so it seems to me that there may be a difference in kind in the immigration crisis today that Lee is failing to recognize. I'm open to the possibility, however, that I'm being a dupe to my own fears and that I am simply tap dancing on the wheel of history and repeating the same errors that others make when I express my xenophobic views. I'd encourage each of you to read the book. Reach your own conclusions, come back to us with them. But again, and I'll write a longer review of this for the newsletter and have it up for next week's distribution. The book is America for Americans, A History of Xenophobia in the United States. Mike, I know you're out there listening. That is, if you haven't crashed your car thinking, Norm, you idiot. I leave you alone and listen to you. I can't even decide what you're talking about. Are you left, right, center, or just confused? Well, Mike, the answer is just confused. Maimonides wrote a great book in the late Middle Ages called The Guide to the Perplexed. We need a new guide to the perplexed. We live in perplexing times. Thanks for tuning in, folks. Hopefully Mike will be in tomorrow so we can have good exit and intro music. And we can have sophisticated graphics. We can have meaningful discussions with folks who've contributed, and we'll have a counterweight to my dribbling nonsense. Thanks for listening to Law and Legitimacy. We'll see you tomorrow morning.